Hand soldering something like this is not recommended, because with over 220 parts it's very time consuming. If you want to hand solder it, this is what I did, and I'll show you what worked and didn't work for me. I would say the magnifying headband is essential, and I practically did the whole thing just with this. Basically it gets you close without actually having to be close. It comes with 5 lenses, which you can double stack for 10 combinations, but I only used a single 2.5 times for everything. The USB microscope is nice, but not essential. I didn't actually use it for soldering. It suffers motion blur because it's laggy, and you can't tell depth because it's only 2D. In the end I only used the USB microscope to film this, and to line up parts because you can see both sides at once. It might have a use for inspection, but you might have to angle it so it's not directly on top. You need the one with the least magnification, the 25 by 200, or you'll never get the height to work under it. You also need a sturdy stand with a lot of height. With the USB microscope at its lowest magnification, 25 times, I'm getting about 120 mils to the shroud. Note the black mark on the silver thumb wheel. This is the shroud touching the PCB. Note the mark on the thumb wheel has only moved quarter of a revolution, which is nowhere near the 200 times this USB microscope can do. Basically the high magnification microscopes are useless because they start at a magnification they should be finishing on. Next is a temperature controlled soldering iron. It's probably not a necessity for a one-off, but if you want to take up electronics as a hobby, it's highly recommended. The STM32 based soldering irons are the cheapest of the T12 directly heated soldering tip soldering irons. The heating element and the temperature sensor are built into the tip, and that means it heats up very quick, like 20 seconds, and it reacts a lot faster to temperature changes. Basically it's cheaper than the popular T100, but with more features and less portability. Good quality solder and flux is essential. None of the eBay stuff could even get close to this locally bought stuff. Use high lead 6040 solder with a flux core and the smallest diameter possible. Use genuine flux from a place you know has a history of good quality, because the difference is like night and day. eBay flux versus American flux. 3 capacitors soldered with the preload tip method. Can you tell the eBay flux? You can even see my hand moving in the reflection of the 2 outer American flux parts. Another big essential is a bright light. This 10-watt floodlight was more than just a light for filming. It was essential to see everything clearly. A PCB rotating jig isn't essential, but it comes in very handy. You can solder parts on one side, tilt it 45 degrees, and then solder on the other side without moving your seat. It even has spring-loaded jaws, so you can quickly take a PCB out and spin it to a better side. You need the obligatory tools, like tweezers to grab parts, maybe a pin and a hobby knife to push parts around, something to hold parts down while you solder them, like these clips, a sponge to clean your soldering iron tip, and some solder wick. This is eBay solder wick, so it doesn't work unless you flux it before you use it. What is essential is a good digital multimeter that can do capacitors, diodes, and whatever else. And along with that is tweezer probes and some super sharp pointy probes. You have to inspect every single soldered joint on your board for bridges and solder not sticking. So as a minimum you need 20 times loop glasses or possibly the USB microscope. I use conical tips for the pinpoint tip positioning, plus there's less tip obscuring your vision. The problem with conical tips is there's less thermal mass, so you have to turn the temperature up on your soldering iron, plus use the side instead of the tip to get more heat transfer. 3 methods of soldering. Number 1. Hold the part down somehow to free both hands. I use my alligator clip with a wire. Touch the pad with the tip and feed solder onto the tip. I used eBay flux, and note how shiny the solder is. The problem is if you touch it up too many times it'll go dull again. Good points are that you always get shiny solder. Bad points are it's very slow, and that you have to double check the solder actually attached to the pad by touching up the joint a couple of times. I abandoned using this method on small parts because it was too slow, but it's great for large parts like ICs. Method 2. Flux the pad and part. I use the American flux here. Preload the solder on the tip. Carefully hold down the part while you apply the tip with solder to the pad. Upsides is that it's very fast. Downsides is that 10% of your joints will be a little bit dull. And again, you won't know if the solder took to the pad, so you'll have to go over them a few times as well. This was the method I ended up using for small parts. Method 3. Flux the pad, apply solder to the pad, hold part in position and apply tip with preloaded solder to the joint. Upsides is that you know one end of the part is definitely connected to the pad. Downsides is you need a very steady hand and that you have to double check the other side of the part that it connected to the pad. The center eBay flux joint was adequate because the rosin caused solder did most of the work. And even though we used the solder preload tip method on the outer two, which burns off all the flux of the solder, the joints were shiny because of the American flux. In part 2 I'll be hand soldering a Frankenstein 1.2 board.